Good evening, gamers, and welcome today to a guide to Insurgence Trick Room. I have seen a good few people talking about this archetype, complaining about it, not quite understanding what's going on with this. So I figured I would take it upon myself to make an entire treatise about the entire thing, as one of the best Insurgence players in the world. So we're going to go over everything here. We're going to go over what it looks like, how it works, how to beat it, the whole 9 yards, and I might be able to impart a few tips while we're on the way. But first off, why am I talking about Trick Room in singles? Isn't Trick Room in singles pretty awful? Well, in Insurgence, we've got the fun item Trick Rock, which is a weather rock for Trick Room. Increases the duration to 8 turns instead of 5, technically 7 turns instead of 4, since the turn it goes up doesn't actually count, really. Now, the Trick Rock single-handedly makes Trick Room a viable draft archetype. It was already kind of bad in normal draft leagues because Trick Room just doesn't last for very long. The ability to make it last a sizable amount longer, especially with Insurgence's Trick Room abusers, makes this pretty terrifying. There are a good number of people I've seen who have clamored for Trick Rock's ban, and I've not totally understood the arguments, but I do get some of them. But those are mostly based in who abuses the Trick Room, because most Insurgence formats don't have regular megas allowed, so the first instinct of Mega Mawile doesn't really work. We've got Mega Stunfisk instead, with its 91 special attack and ability that doubles that statistic, Athenian, alongside a truly superb bulk line that makes even Skarmory jealous. Mega Stunfisk is incredibly powerful, and with Trick Room set up, is capable of steamrolling entire teams. Past that, we've also got Simple Swords Dance with 20 base speed, who sets up Trick Room for itself, and why not? Let's throw Melmetal on top of it. These three are the definitive Insurgence poster children for Trick Room, and we'll be seeing them a fair bit throughout this presentation. So now that we know the really big differences of Insurgence Trick Room, we need to talk about the biggest difference. Mega Reuniclus. There is technically an Insurgence Pokemon that sets up Trick Room on Switch It. Normally you have to do this manually, but Mega Reuniclus' ability Speed Swap does it automatically. So why don't people use it? If you've played Insurgence Draft, you've seen plenty of teams get drafted, and nobody touches Mega Reuniclus. Well, because the developers got there before you did. They buffed its speed to 80, quote-unquote buffed its speed to 80. This is really a nerf. That, combined with the inability to hold Trick Rock, really means Mega Reuniclus' Trick Room is for itself. But now it has 80 speed, so it's pretty hard to use it, especially when opponents are prepared for it. I have tried to make this thing work. It did not end well. I tried to run minimum speed to outslow a Heatran. The Heatran ran minimum speed to outslow me. So forgive me if I don't touch on Mega Reuniclus more over the course of this presentation. I had to get this out of the way first. It mixes like oil and water with the actual strategy. It unfortunately just does not do what we're looking for it to do. But back to the primary program. What does Insurgence Trick Room actually look like? Well, we start off with some beneficiaries. I talked about Delta Escavalier earlier, but we'll get back to them. I say beneficiaries as opposed to abusers because these three Pokemon I just have as examples. Mega Stunfisk, Melmetal, both Ursaluna forms. They're good Pokemon outside of Trick Room. They do not need Trick Room to succeed, but the ability to have Trick Room for them can be an incredibly powerful option for some rosters. Next, their bestest friends in the whole world, the pivot setters. Your Slowbros, your Uxies, your Claydolls, you've got plenty of options in here. It's really just set Trick Room, have defensive stats, and be able to get your Trick Room abusers in safely after this Pokemon has set up Trick Room. You'll commonly see these relative do-nothings have Trick Rock attached to them, and their 2 moves be relatively pigeonholed for this, for the purposes of at least the Trick Room archetype. Next up, we've got some self-sufficient guys. Delta Escavalier, Mega Spiritomb, and Stack Attack are really the ones that come to mind, but there are plenty of options you can use for self-sufficient Pokemon. The primary gist of this role is using Trick Room primarily for your own benefit. Those 3 mons, as opposed to the pivot setters, have incredible power backing them up. They get Trick Room up, and that's basically their version of an agility or a dragon dance. Trick Room is their setup move. For the most part, it's their speed setup move. But the ability to flip the script on a more offensive opponent can lead these guys to absolutely going nuts. If you're going to spec hard into Trick Room, though, might be able to pick up some low-tier bombs. I have seen these guys do frankly ridiculous work. Delta Reuniclus, Torkoal, Delta Octillery, some fantastic examples, but there are plenty more. Absolutely. Go experiment. Find something that's reasonably slow and make it work as a low-tier option. You can throw a muck in Trick Room and probably succeed with it. I really want to see that happen now. These 3 Pokemon, but what you're really focusing on, my apologies, what you're really focusing on with the low-tier bombs is having decent low tiers already. Delta Reuniclus does things outside of just clicking Trick Room, or could perhaps be a more self-sufficient piece. Torkoal sets up Sun. It's a fantastic support mon that helps with other archetypes, but can also work in Trick Room. Delta Octillery punishes do-nothing walls something fierce while boosting while attacking and threatening with a priority move and great coverage. You do not need Trick Room for them. And I'm going to be hammering that home a lot. You don't need Trick Room for these guys, but they're great in Trick Room for not a whole lot of points. And finally, depending on just how... Depending on just how hard you want to focus on Trick Room, there is always the option of getting a little bit weird with it. I have seen Trick Room Delta Chandelure. It has 80 speed. If you're up against an opponent with frankly ridiculous speed tiers, Trick Room Delta Shandy might be what you're looking for. Delta Milotic has the possibility of doing it, doesn't necessarily do it all the time, or really ever, but it can. Hoopa falls into much the same boat. It has the ability to go for Trick Room, and it can do support, it can do offense. There's a lot of depth to this strategy. Now, I know most of these are like ghosts, psychics, and fairies, but that's just the nature of the typing and who gets access to these sorts of moves. But let's move on. Insurgence Trick Room has a lot of options and a lot of different compatibilities. You can kind of just throw these into other rosters. But if you do decide to build Trick Room, what does the rest of the team look like? You're really looking for gaps. You're looking to fill the gaps in speed and defensive use. You probably have some pretty good bulk lines anyway if you're looking in just your primary abuser and your primary setter. So you want to get them defensive buddies. You want to get them speed options for outside of Trick Room. You want to make sure you have the proper sorts of utility. Hazards can be a big deal for Trick Room, putting things into the edge for a Trick Room attacker to really power through. Depending on which specific abusers you have, you may be able to rely on them. And you can definitely rely on them for power as well. If you're building a Trick Room team, power is not something you'll really be wanting for. You're going to be needing something fast, something to sort of bail your team out after Trick Room goes down. And how heavily you choose to focus on Trick Room will dictate exactly what kinds of Pokemon you're looking for. Make sure you actually focus on this. Trick Room should not be the only plan of your roster. Don't be like my friend Necrowolfs, who built a Trick Room team whose speed capped out at 95 and had one horrible defogger. I don't care that you did well, Necro. You lost in quarters for a reason. So let's get into a quick rundown of the 3 main ways of building Trick Room teams. The first is hardcore focus. I want to go big into the Trick Room. I want to have it as one of my primary means for immediate damage, and I want to click Banded Melmetal Double Iron Bash. That sort of stuff. These sorts of teams often will have multiple setters and abusers, typically that synergize with one another in some form of way. As we see on this team on the left, we've got Delta Escavalier and Cresselia as the primary Trick Room setters. Don't share a weakness. Fantastic. Primary abusers, Escavalier, Melmetal. Awesome. Love it. What about their game plan for outside of Trick Room? Well, we've got Mega Delta Gallade being as terrifying as ever, Hydreigon, baiting in fairies for Melmetal nonsense, and the end game plan of a Delta Arcanine cleanup. Fantastic. All with Cresselia, Moltres, Delta Torterra forming a good defensive backbone while giving you hazards and removal exactly where you're needing it. I love this team. It's a great example of what Trick Room exactly means. Doesn't have to be doing it, but it goes great when you want to. Plus, you've got a couple of options in case things go south. But Trick Room teams can often have some somewhat weird speed tiers. Let's look at this team on the right for a second. Yes, we've got 130, 123, 108. Fantastic. Where does it go from there? We drop to 60 on the speed. Kind of a problem. So if we're doing that, this is kind of a massive hole. Yes, we've got multiple setters. We've got Slowking, we've got Escavalier, we've got Meowscarada if you're a psychopath, and on the abuser end, you can do Wailord things, but it's mostly here for Stunfisk. Admittedly, this is an 8-mon team compared to most of the other things I'm going to be displaying over the course of this treatise, which inherently limits its options, as you can see by the fact that there's a lair on there. But I figured it was a decent example to show off what exactly this hardcore Trick Room variant is going for in the first place. Pardon the interruption. I am recording this outside, so occasionally planes fly overhead. But let's move on. The second primary way people can build Trick Room in Insurgents is backdoor Trick Room. Having a team that's perfectly competent on its own outside of any sort of field condition, but can get a Trick Room mode off if the situation presents itself. We're looking at this team on the left, Musharna into Blood Moon or Snorlax. That's already scary enough. Blood Moon's got enough power to supply the entire team, and Dragapult and Tapu Koko really bring up the other end of things with some solid utility options in Vespiquen and Tentacruel. Mega Delta Bisharp really just rounds this whole thing out, and the 3 low tiers don't particularly matter, but it is worth discussing. Crabominable in Trick Room can do a fair bit. Backdoor Trick Room variants often will get their low tiers involved into their roster to really make things mesh, or even just to provide some sort of option. A sort of weirder backdoor option would be this team on the right. We've got Slowbro into Mega Fist. Boom. Easy. Let's build a team around it. Cakestill and Sneasler for late game sweeping. Coco's on the previous team. What are you talking about? We've got Tapu Bulu, Moltres, Goldango. Decent enough defensive options. A Sneasel. I can work with a Sneasel. I don't like this team terribly much, but it is a fairly good example of what backdoor Trick Room means. Backdoor Trick Room is a backup plan. These teams can do great things without Trick Room available to them necessarily as an option, or without pursuing it at all. And then there's the third kind of Trick Room team, the much weirder kind of Trick Room team. Hybrid. You can combine Trick Room with other things. If you've ever fought Double Weather, you might recognize some of these sorts of things. The ability to blend almost seamlessly 2 very different strategies into one roster can make for some very powerful team compositions. This team on the left is something I and my couple of friends of mine have had to face recently. Trick Room Sun. They're held together by Delta Octillery and Torkoal. double Protosynthesis Mon, Ridiculous Fires, Melmetal on the Trick Room end, Lilligant on the Sun end. Woo! With Roaring Moon outside of both conditions being just feasible, although still buffed in Sun. Admittedly, this league allowed terrestrialization, so Slitherwing and Delta Artillery were the Terra Captains of this roster. Was an incredibly fun team to face because it was so tricky to work with. There's a whole lot of power on this roster, and that's really what you're looking for in a Trick Room team. Here on the right, we've got the glued together Howled by Galarian Slowking. It ties the Snow of Delta Scyther Alolan Ninetales with the Trick Room of Mega Stunfisk and Dog. It's got decent enough defensive options. You can have Porygon 2 on the bulky end as well. It can set up Trick Room for you. Got Dredigan Bronzong, another possible Trick Room setter, really hard leaning into these 2-mon pairings for individual bits of success. Hybrid Trick Room can force opponents to sort of guess which of your 2 modes you're bringing to a game. There are some mons that will do well against both modes, but Weather and Trick Room are things you normally want to hyper-focus your prep around if the team is fairly obviously dedicated to it. This is a bit of an issue with Backdoor because those teams are more general, but there's a lot of depth hiding within the Trick Room Insurgence archetype. I mentioned Weather a bit earlier, especially with what we were just talking about. Trick Room is similar to Weather? How? Well, there are a fair few often missed similarities, and you can prep for Trick Room and Weather in some pretty similar ways. There's another plane. You can prepare for Trick Room and Weather in some fairly similar ways. If you envision in your head what a Weather team in Draft really means, they're typically built around 2-mon pairings, a setter of a field condition and an abuser of that field condition, who have to navigate through the temporary nature of that condition while modifying the speed order in their favor. That sounds a good bit like Trick Room. With Weather, the options are more narrow compared to Trick Room, but it's still some pretty similar principles. You absolutely destroy hyper offense. They're fairly obvious to spot if you know what you're looking for. They have a bad habit of overwhelming people's defensive answers and forcing complaints about them. And you can prep for them somewhat similarly. If you've ever had to fight a rain team, did you bring some really weird Choice Scarf Mon specifically tailored to outrun the Swift Swimmer in rain? There's very similar stuff you can pull against Trick Room, but we'll get to that later. It's that sort of thinking that you're going to want to be thinking about as we continue into the How to Beat Trick Room section. But Trick Room and Weather aren't exactly the same. There are a few very, very key differences. For one, Weather's set up automatically by abilities for the most part, unless you're a psychopath and doing it like Gen 4 underused. Trick Room has to be set up manually. Somebody has to burn a turn to use Trick Room. You have to have somebody that knows the move in order to actually use it. However, as a trade-off, Trick Room Pokemon, Trick Room abusers in particular, typically have more use outside of Trick Room. I can bring my Slowbro to a game without bringing my Melmetal. I can bring my Melmetal without bringing my Slowbro. I can't really bring my Delta Superior without bringing my Delta Dragonite, or vice versa. The Weather abusers rely on their signature condition to really get things going, and while they can still do some good work outside of it, it's much rarer to see and much easier to stop. Weather, however, does influence the power of attacks. Rain boosts water moves, Sun boosts fire moves, Darkness boosts dark and ghost moves. Trick Room doesn't really have that luxury because there's no big, oh, I get a damage bonus for going first. No, we don't have that capability. However, Trick Room gets pretty varied type coverage because we're not exactly pigeonholed into just waters or just fires, or ices are all of the Slush Rush Pokemon, or you're really looking for Ghosts and Darks for the Darkness archetype. No. You've got a lot of options. The primary poster children of Trick Room are a Ground Electric, a Steel, a Fairy, and a Normal. There's a lot of depth here. But what's this little bit here? The secret sauce problem. Why the hell did you bring that up? But let's get into that. Yes, folks, we are finally entering the time where S is going to tell you how to beat Stinking Trick Room. So let's just hop right into it. There are three main ways that you can beat a Trick Room team. The first is trying to stall Trick Room out and enact your game plan outside of the field condition. Now, this is the part people struggle with, and I can understand why they do. Mega Stunfisk is really hard to take on in Trick Room. Melmetal is really hard to take on in Trick Room. And some teams just don't have the options of going for this. But you probably have more options than you think you do. Defensive options are at least possible. Switching into Bended Melmetal isn't pretty, but if you have a decently bulky Water who doesn't immediately drop to a coverage move, you might be able to toss it in against Melmetal, burn a couple of turns. Against... I'm sorry. I did not script this video. Sometimes I'm at a loss for things to say. Even if your defensive options aren't great, every turn counts. Switch your Landorus T into an Earth Power and try to bait a Scald into your Keldeo. Then maybe go back and forth. It's not pretty, but you've gotten to the point where Mega Stunfisk is in Trick Room. A pretty solution is kind of not helpful at this point. You have to be on your toes if you don't have good defensive options. But if you do have good defensive options, use them. Absolutely. Stalling out Trick Room is a very powerful thing. And even if you don't think you have defensive options, one, you very well may if you think a little bit harder at it. And two, every Mon learns Protect. Every turn burn counts. If you've got something that can realistically throw Protect on its set if you don't need another coverage option, have Protect. Burn a Trick Room turn, get out of there. Switch in on one move, Protect, leave. Or just Protect as the setter comes in. It's not pretty, it's not flashy, but it does help. And I don't think people really get that a whole lot. But what if you don't have those sorts of defensive answers? What if you can't afford Protect on any of your Pokemon? All of your Melmetal switch-ins just drop to an Earthquake, and Mega Stunfisk in Trick Room is literally the worst thing ever. And this is where the banning cries come in. There's no way to handle Mega Stunfisk in Trick Room. Well then, why are you letting Mega Stunfisk have Trick Room? People don't particularly mention this enough. Denying weather isn't really a possibility. You can try to change it in the aftermath, but what are you supposed to deny? Something switching in one time? That's not going to happen. Denying Trick Room, on the other hand, while still not perfect of a solution, is still pretty feasible. It has to be set up manually. So taunt it. It's a status move. Absolutely taunt it. Throw your taunts around. Have someone that can realistically take the hits of whoever the Trick Room abuser is. Throw a taunt out. And if Trick Room goes up, do you have something fat that can turn Trick Room off? You can use Trick Room of your own to get it out of there. Even more surprisingly, and something I only really have done research on recently, phasing moves work. Phasing moves have a priority of -6. Trick Room has a priority of -7. It's definitely strange to see a Garchomp Dragon Tail move first in a turn and be that turn's only action, but I've seen it happen before. Even those folks that don't have taunt can still pitch in the anti-Trick Room brigade, essentially. And even if you don't have any of those utility options, might as well just throw big boom booms out. A choice band Infernape flare blitzes into a Uxie, dealing about 40 to 50. Let's say 50. I don't actually know what the calc is. Infernape might not be able to deny that first Trick Room. Uxie's going to get it up, Uxie's probably going to dip, and something bad's going to happen to the roster. But Infernape probably just denied the second go-around, because the setter's pretty low at this point. It's going to be hard for Uxie to get back in and go for Trick Room again. So you might only have one round to go through. And if you only have one round to go through, that's a big help. I mentioned earlier in the difference between Trick Room and Weather, the secret sauce problem. And I'm a huge, huge fan of this third way of beating Trick Room. You can beat Trick Room at its own game. I'm not locked in here with you, your team can cry to the Mega Stunfisk. You're locked in here with me. Take a peek at your team's speed tiers. You probably have something slower than your opponent's Trick Room abuser. Mega Stunfisk's speed clocks in at 57. Yes, it's going to go min speed, but if you've got anything slower than 57, that turns from random utility idiot to powerful weapon. I included Donphan as an image here. You've got a Donphan against Trick Room? Get it to find its way in on an electric move, or literally anyhow at all, even just a pivot option. Clock Mega Stunfisk with an Earthquake, because you go first now. You can find plenty of things on a roster that can be slower than these 57s, 50s, 52s. 34s, admittedly a little bit more of a problem. But you got a Delta Snorlax, that's an option. You've got a Bronzong, that'll work. You got a Slowking, boom, awesome. You've got more depth on your team than you think you do. The ability to recognize when you need to take a slow Pokemon that typically is just here for utility and turn it into a threat to push your advantage is very important. And it'll help you against Trick Room significantly. You'll have to flip your evaluation of your own team on its head. If Dragapult's speed is a problem, well, maybe Delta Regirock's slowness is a helper. Also, don't be afraid to run Iron Ball. Iron Ball on a decently slow Pokemon can help you out a lot. Before you ask about room service, the speed drop of only one stage as opposed to two, and it being single use as opposed to constant, makes things slightly problematic, because you're probably not going to be slow enough, and you're definitely not going to be slow enough twice. Trick Room teams often aren't prepared to weather their own assaults, so if you can worm your way to a Trick Room abuser against Trick Room, that's some fantastic work you can do there, boss. I've seen Iron Ball Delta Golurk in a Trick Room matchup. 4 knockouts, easy. Just because the opponent wasn't ready to take a close combat. They thought they'd be faster with their 34 and 45 speed abusers. But let's wrap this up, shall we? I kind of want to head back inside myself. In conclusion, Trick Rock makes Trick Room a real thing in Insurgence Draft. Preparation for Trick Room is very necessary. You don't have to have a perfect plan, but you do have to have something. You don't need to build your team in the draft stage with Trick Room in mind, but it's good to have a decent idea. It's the kind of playstyle that rewards opponents for creative and specific bits of prep, and if you aren't ready for it, you're just gonna get bowled over. That's kind of how Trick Room works, but that's also how Weather works, and Weather's been perfectly fine for a while. Trick Room provides a lot of depth because of how you can use Trick Room against its proponent. You can use their Trick Room to your advantage. And I think that's incredibly cool. You often have more options to combat Trick Room than you think you do. Bulk on Pokemon that don't normally run it. Offenses on Pokemon that don't normally run it. Your slow guys becoming fast and turning into your most important weapons. Your fast guys having to take a little bit more of a calculated approach. It can be really cool if you're willing to sit down, take a breath, and think about it. Trick Rock isn't ban-worthy, and I hope that this presentation has taught you not just how to use it better, but how to take it on. Thank you all for tuning in, and I hope you enjoyed Insurgence Draft and Trick Room in it just as much as I have.